Boeing was one of the flagship American companies that people looked to for American innovation and manufacturing. They are one of the leading aerospace manufacturers, building everything from airplanes, rockets, satellites, and much more. They are also the second biggest defense contractor in the world. So what happened to this American icon, and how did things turn so bad so quickly? In this video, we are going to look at how Boeing gained its dominance, and what changes were made that ultimately led to its downfall. We are also going to look at what they are doing to try and turn the company around and fix the previous issues. Before we begin, as always, like and subscribe to support the channel. Let's start by looking at a brief history of Boeing and how they became an American icon. Boeing started back in 1917 by William Boeing. At this time, Boeing was making seaplanes. Their seaplanes weren't the most popular, but gave them a start in the airplane business. Once World War II started, they became the go-to manufacturer for military aircrafts. This is where Boeing really became an American icon. They were seen as a critical part of the war effort, and even gave us Rosie the Riveter to encourage females to join the workforce since all labor was needed. After World War II, they pivoted from making military planes and focused on making commercial airliners. Their first jetliner was the Boeing 707, which was released in 1958 and was a big success. The 707 laid the foundation for the commercial airline industry, as it made flying cheaper so more people could have the option for air travel. I go more into depth about the history of the airline business in my Pan Am vs. TWA video. Boeing soon created one of the biggest commercial successes, which was the 747. This plane was one of the most utilized planes, especially for shorter flights. Southwest relied on this plane because it was safe, reliable, and fuel efficient. As more planes began flying, the safer air travel got. Air travel is one of the safest forms of transportation. Compared to driving, air travel is almost 3 times safer than driving. You have a 1 in 1/14 chance of having a fatality while driving, and only a 1 in 9,821 chance while flying. You are more likely to choke on food than die in a plane crash. After many iterations on the 747 model, the 747 MAX was released. This was the plane that ultimately led to Boeing's reputation being tarnished. The release of the 747 MAX was the tipping point for Boeing, but the problem started before the 747 MAX was released. In 1997, Boeing merged with McDonnell Douglas, which was another well-known aerospace manufacturer. This was seen as a great move, especially from Wall Street investors. Before this, Boeing wasn't seen as a great stock because they had a lot of overhead and expenses. Investors thought McDonnell Douglas was going to come in and clean up Boeing's balance sheet and create wider margins on their planes, while Boeing kept innovating and making great planes. It soon became clear that McDonnell Douglas was taking over Boeing instead of Boeing taking over McDonnell Douglas. Harry Stonecipher, who was the previous McDonnell Douglas CEO, became COO of the companies that combined. He made it clear that he was going to bring financial stability to Boeing. As time went on and when more management and company culture became more like McDonnell Douglas, Stonecipher was eventually made CEO of Boeing and continued focusing on controlling the cost of the company. Workers of the company soon started to feel the cost-cutting measures as they were set in place. Pay and benefits were being cut, new equipment for factories and shop floor were cut, new materials were harder to get, and other processes were cut to save time on manufacturing. Boeing also started outsourcing some of the airplane's components overseas, so a lot of the workforce was laid off. Boeing also decided to move its headquarters to Chicago instead of staying in Seattle, where the planes were being made and have been since the start of the company. Boeing said they did this because it was a central location to customers and they were closer to the financial community. This really showed the shift in Boeing's company culture from engineering and safety to higher returns for investors. In 2007, the 787 Dreamliner was announced. And Boeing had plans to try a new system. Instead of designing and manufacturing everything in-house, they wanted to outsource the pieces to different companies, which would make the plane cheaper. This system did not go well, as Boeing was 3 years late on the delivery of the 787 Dreamliner and $50 billion over budget. The workers soon reached their breaking point, and in September of 2008, 27,000 machinists at Boeing went on strike. By November, the workers and Boeing reached a deal, which was one of the biggest wins for workers, as Boeing was going to use less outsourcing on future airplanes, including the 787 Dreamliner. This was the longest strike against Boeing, and during this time, it is estimated that Boeing was losing over $100 million a day because production stopped and planes weren't being delivered. Boeing still kept outsourcing many of its components and eventually refined the process, and the Dreamliner brought in huge profits for Boeing. Instead of reinvesting these profits into research and development to build a better plane, Boeing started to buy back its own stock to increase its stock prices so investors can make a profit. From 2014 to 2019, Boeing spent $38 billion on buying back its own stock. That was almost 90% of total cash on hand being returned to investors. In less than 10 years, Boeing's stock tripled and was seen as a great stock to own. Boeing soon was selling record numbers of the 737 MAX, which was Boeing's answer to the new Airbus A320neo, which had better fuel economy than the previous 737 and required no additional training for pilots. Boeing was forced to rush out the 737 MAX as fast as possible and match the performance of the A320neo with no additional pilot training. The 737 MAX was actually released early and was Boeing's fastest release ever. But to be able to achieve a quick release, Boeing had to hide some critical things from the FAA so they wouldn't be delayed. The biggest thing Boeing had to hide was a new software called MCATs, which would make the plane fly exactly like the other 737s, so pilots would not need additional training. Boeing hid this system because if they didn't, pilots would need additional training to use the system, which would be against their contracts with the airlines. On October 29, 2018, a 737 MAX crashed as the MCAT system took over the plane, and 5 months later, another plane went down on March 10, 2019. After this, all 737 MAXs were grounded. During this time, Boeing lost $18.6 billion and would report its first annual loss since 1997. Dennis Muhlenberg, who was the CEO of Boeing, was forced out of the company. David Calhoun was appointed CEO and immediately started making changes. He is focused on bringing Boeing back to its former glory and repairing Boeing's safety record. Boeing used to be an American icon, building planes that helped the Allies in World War II, but now is seen as a greedy company only looking out for Wall Street investors. We will see if the company will go back to its focus on engineering rather than profits. And with that being said, as always, thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe to see more videos.